High-level trade talks have taken place in Washington, led by Chinese Vice Premier Liu He and U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer. With just a month left before the 90-day truce deadline expires on March the 1st, what has come out of this round of trade talks? What can be expected in the time that remains? And after the White House announced a meeting between Trump and Liu He, what further did the unpredictable president have up his sleeves? To discuss all these and much more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, and Jake Parker, Vice President of the China Operations at the U.S.-China Business Council. And that is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. Okay, our topic today is about the trade talks between China and the U.S. in Washington. The Chinese side have made some statement that the two sides have already had candid, specific, and fruitful discussions, and there were important progress. And also the White House made a statement on several of the areas that they may move along. What do you make of the progress so far on the trade talks this time? John?
I think probably both sides have made substantial progress. There are still some issues unresolved yet, and I think it's left for their future negotiations. Mr. Ambassador Lighthizer and Secretary Mnuchin are going to fly to Beijing very soon, and there will still be some more issues that are going to be discussed and agreed upon. I think I used the words agreed upon by President Xi and President Trump for the meeting they're going to have before March 1st, and if not two. President Trump's answer in the press conference said one, if not two. So probably they're going to meet at least one.
But what is the progress already made this round in Washington?
Well, this is scantily discussed in the press releases so far. But my feeling is that, of course, they talk about the purchases. I think the issue of alleviating the trade deficit, deficit from the American side is greatly addressed, I think. So I think what's still up to discussion and still haven't been 100% resolved so far are things pertaining to those structural issues, as we all know it, especially I think in area of intellectual property right protection and forced technology transfer. These are the two issues that the American side is concerned about most.
And how do you look at what is going on in Washington between the two delegations?
Well, I think I agree with Professor Gong that the expectation that China and the U.S. have come to some kind of consensus on new purchases of U.S. agriculture and energy products, that seems to be moving forward fruitfully. Some of the structural issues like intellectual property rights protection, liberalizing investment restrictions in China seem to also be on the agenda, and I suspect that some progress has been made there. In our conversations with the Chinese government, they've told us that areas that align with China's development goals, such as those that were announced by President Xi during his speech at the CIIE conference and also the Boao Forum, are areas where we can see forward momentum. So those would be investment liberalizations, would be increased intellectual property rights protection, and some additional movement perhaps on industrial policy.
But isn't this what they have already agreed on last May during last trip of Vice Premier Liu He? They agreed to buy more agricultural products and energy products from the U.S., and they also vowed to better protect IPR from the U.S. Anything changed?
So what I think that the challenge is on the U.S. side is that there's a feeling among the negotiators that China has not fully implemented on its commitments in the past. So they're trying to find a way to find an enforceable agreement that's also verifiable. So I sense the two sides are very much deep in negotiations now about how they can set timelines and then assess on the implementation of those timelines going forward and create triggers to ensure that both sides are living up to the expectation of the other.
Okay, let's talk about that. Enforceable, how to verify these.
Right.
Do you think China can accept a mechanism that will say we will verify whether our promises are met, whether the Americans are satisfied with what we've done?
Well, anything intrusive, any enforcement intrusive, anything that touches upon the sovereign rights of this country is just off the limits. I think this is unbelievable that the country can do something like this. But on the other hand, I think enforcement is very important. If you read Lighthizer's speech today, he mentioned enforcement twice, actually. So that means it's actually an important issue for the American side. But I think on the Chinese side, we actually are doing a lot of things, and we are legislating things, right? I mean, that I don't know what else can be more serious than legislation. And this piece of legislation, the Foreign Investment Act or law, is currently being discussed, and we're circulating among experts for opinions, and looks like it's going to be enacted. I think it's going to be March 3rd, I think, yeah. So you know,
yes.
The expectation is that this is going to be passed.
As you said, the top legislators are now having a new document on the foreign investment law, try to ensure the national treatment for international companies, including American business, and even providing some preferential policies for foreign investors under certain circumstances.
Yeah.
So this is what do you think are the terms that will be better for investors for China? Already there are some domestic companies crying, well, this is unfair. Why foreign investors should be treated differently?
Well, I mean, the exact language of this bill still hasn't been finalized yet. I think we have seen some interesting comments from experts and scholars. So I think the issue you bring up is a very interesting issue. I think the overall theme should be the level playing field. That means that the foreign companies should be treated the same way as domestic companies. But more importantly, domestic companies shouldn't be treated worse than foreign companies, right? So I think the issue you raised is a very interesting one, and I hope that it can be addressed.
I want your take on a level playing field. Of course, there are a lot of foreign businesses here running in China, but they have their concerns, sometimes complaints. What do you think of the specific issues that you think the Chinese government can move improve?
Well, so I actually agree completely with Professor Gong that we should have that complete equal treatment between U.S. foreign companies and also Chinese companies. But the best way to do that is to eliminate the foreign investment law entirely and regulate all companies under the company law. That's the way you ensure that all companies are being treated exactly equally in China. But to speak specifically to the ways that the Chinese government could address some of the concerns of foreign companies, what we hear is that when China's top-level policymakers talk about competitive neutrality and ensuring foreign companies have equal access to subsidies, industrial policies at the local level, frequently that doesn't seem to filter down. We've talked to some companies...
So it's still an enforcement problem?
It's an enforcement problem as well as just allowing that policy to be fully grasped at the local level. I'll give you an example. We have a company that participates in government procurement projects for hospitals in China, and they've told us that though it's not listed publicly on the tender documents, that being a domestic company gives you a +5 point advantage on the overall tendering document. It's not public, it's not written down anywhere, but in their conversations with the hospital that's become clear. So a company that's tendering for that as a foreign company is automatically going to be at a disadvantage to a domestic company.
Automatically at a disadvantage.
Well, these issues, I think, are precise the things that we need to rectify. I think that...
And that's why the Chinese set up a law.
Right, we have a piece of legislation pending here that's going to address these issues. But I also want to tell some stories on the other side. I know, for example, BMW is a huge operation in the city of Shenyang in Jiexi district.
That's a European company.
It's a European company, and I was told that BMW is actually treated very well by the local government. Even talking about the subsidies,
probably too well.
Probably too well. Even talking about the subsidies provided or the tax rebates by the government, they are entitled to all these things, not short of 1 penny compared to any domestic company. So I think it's probably a two-sided story.
We have to judge case by case. Right. Probably different cases in different contexts have different reasons. But generally, we have to know there is a legal platform ensuring every player has the same chance and access, right?
But if I could just talk about the foreign investment law specifically, it was published for the first time January 2015. We saw the second draft emerge in December 2018. And then we immediately saw the second reading in January, just a few days ago. But the comment period for seeking comments from industry groups like ours, from companies, is February 28th. So the time between the first reading in December and in January,
I know the reason why.
They then had a second reading without soliciting and receiving feedback from companies and organizations like ours. So when we talk about transparency and rule of law, it's incredibly important that they have that information before they go forward with the implementation of the law.
I agree. I think the issue is that they want to have this legislation passed very close to their March 1st deadline, I think. That's probably the constraint. But I totally agree with you. There should be a due process that to seek public opinions, including opinions from foreign companies, especially American companies.
And we will submit our feedback on the law, but just to give you one specific example, in the January 2015 version, there were 5 pages that went over the national security review process in the foreign investment law. The new version has 2 sentences. So I fear that in trying to accelerate the process of review, we're missing out on some of the detail that will be incredibly useful for foreign companies operating here.
So it's not so clear about whether you will fall into traps somewhere.
Or that additional implementing regulations will be needed in the future to clarify the details of the law, and that pushes, again, the implementation down the road months and years into the future.
All right, let's talk about another thing, is that the State Council have another draft amendment to the intellectual property law, which is also a very contentious issue. China in January launched the first appeal court for IPR disputes. We know there are IPR courts in different cities already, and they have received cases not only from overseas companies, but also Chinese companies. So IPR courts specifically for the cases of IPR contentions, that should be a good sign for China to step up efforts to protect IPR, not just foreign companies.
Absolutely. I think, well, actually, I don't even mind saying that I'm personally involved in several IPR disputes involving foreign companies, actually. Actually, I am quite confident that foreign companies can at least have a very large likelihood of prevailing eventually in the court of law. So I think these are very good signs, and I hope I think the issue is not so much just about the law itself. It also has things to do with the implementation, the legal process at the court, and in these areas, I think the Chinese courts are actually improving. They're learning things. I think to many judges, they're just quite new to them.
Yeah, it's new to them, and it is happening on a large scale. We have to admit the technology transfer is happening, and it's happening on a large scale from the advanced economies to China and others. That's why we need courts to judge and make a final ruling on those. Of course, there will be complaints from American companies about whether there is forced technology transfer. But do you think we're on the right track?
I would say that when we talk to our member companies, intellectual property rights protection is an area that they've seen significant progress on over the last 10 years. We do a survey every year of our member companies to understand the top challenges of operating in the market. In 2010, intellectual property rights protection was the 4th most concerning issue for companies operating here. Fourth. This year, or last year in 2018, it had moved down to the 10th issue.
Okay.
So that means that it's improving.
So the companies feel that it is not that urgent.
Absolutely. Well, it remains an urgent issue and more can be done, but the formulation of the special IP courts in Beijing, Shanghai, Fujian, Guangzhou, the new implementation of the Supreme People's Court's appeals mechanism, the acceleration of the patent law, all of these are positive signals and tangible signals of us moving forward. More can still be done. For example, we'd like to see more criminal penalties for IPR commercial scale infringement to ensure that those infringers aren't just looking at an administrative penalty and the cost of doing business. They're actually going to prison if they're infringing on a commercial scale. There's more that can be done, but again, progress has been made.
Well, my comment is that it's a more broader philosophical issue. I think you speak of intellectual property rights. I'm more familiar with antitrust laws, for example. In the U.S., it's a criminal offense in the U.S., right? But here in China, as well as in Europe, they are not criminal. They are civil cases. Companies get a fine. Executives don't go to jail.
And
in the U.S.,
different legal systems.
Exactly.
Different readings.
So that's probably
should be punishable.
My feeling is that this issue is probably not going to be addressed in a very short.
But it's a dialogue.
It's a dialogue. Yeah, we can discuss these things. Right.
Okay, we've been talking about the latest trade talks in Washington. We'll be back in a minute. Don't go away. Let's talk about some technical details. For example, Vice Premier Liu He met with President Donald Trump, joined by almost all the cabinet members, Secretary of State, Vice President, and also the negotiators. And what is important is that President Trump announced that probably the final deal will be made when he meets President Xi.
Right.
What does this say about the timeline and the pressure felt by both sides on reaching a deal at last?
The timeline is very clear. I think later on he mentioned that whether the March 1st deadline is going to be missed or not, and he said he went into great detail about the need to put things in writing, put it on paper. So my feeling is that they're probably scheduling a meeting between President Xi and President Trump towards the end of February. So it's to be very close to the March 1st deadline. And he knows that, and he's a bit concerned that if there's enough time to translate those things agreed upon by these two people into a legal document, and that takes some time, I guess. And he's a little bit concerned. He said, should we extend that deadline or not? Later on, I think the White House came back and said the March 1st deadline is still a very hard deadline. Yeah. So I think
it's a hard deadline.
It's a hard deadline. Yeah, it's a hard deadline. Yeah. So that means that I think both sides are expecting agreement can be reached. They're talking at that level, I think, right? That means that they have a lot of confidence in reaching an agreement.
But who do you think is under more pressure to reach that deadline? That means who will give probably more compromises?
I think both sides are, well, I mean, come on, it's not just pressure. I mean, we need to make agreement. I think we need to make agreement. Otherwise, we're in big trouble. I think, of course, on our side, we don't want to see the tariffs going up by 25%, right? And the American side, I think President Trump also needs a big win, a big victory. And he's facing a lot of political pressure. He's still entangled in this battle with the Congress regarding the war on the southern border. And there are other political troubles for him. I think we haven't heard many good news coming from the White House for quite some time. And this could be something, as he described, as a very big deal. A very big deal is a big deal to him. So I think, he's equally under pressure to reach something.
Let's talk a little bit about technology, because there are voices coming out of White House, especially Larry Kudlow and Peter Navarro. Peter Navarro said that China is basically trying to steal the future of Japan, the U.S. and Europe by going after our technology. I think by that he means that the industrial policies of China made in 2025, but that wasn't mentioned that much in this round of negotiations. Will that be still a contentious issue for both sides? Because obviously there were different understandings about how industrial policies should be carried out, made, and enforced. So how should we look at this, Jay?
Well, I agree with you completely. I think that Mr. Navarro's comments were related to Made in China 2025 and industrial policy more generally. There's absolutely no problem with a sovereign country moving up the industrial value chain in sectors like aviation and new energy vehicles, biotech. Every country wants to do that.
Artificial intelligence.
Exactly. But I think the way that we do it matters, and the way that China implements those policies is a concern of the United States.
Yeah.
For example, if the government is heavily subsidizing the development of certain technologies, if it's restricting foreign companies from having an equal level playing field in those sectors by having industry funds which support the development of those technologies.
But actually China invited high-tech companies to come to China to join. It's the Americans who doesn't want to export those technologies legally, I mean.
Well, export controls are very narrowly tailored and are applicable only to a very narrow selection of U.S. technologies. But effectively, China has also set market share targets, both domestically and then also internationally, for its own domestic products to reach by certain dates. And that, again, gets to this idea of concern about creating a non-level playing field and uncompetitive environment where competitive U.S. companies like our members are unable to compete on a level playing field because their domestic competitor rivals are getting money from the government, they're getting low-interest loans and the like.
Okay, those kind of things, there's all been complaints. Whether the Chinese companies has been favored by the government indirectly through bank loans, land transfer, those kind of things.
Well, my opinion on this issue is that all governments, the leading economies, to some extent subsidize R&D, subsidize research.
Their own industries, in some way.
Exactly.
The Americans subsidize their own business.
Right.
In some way.
The American also
some
spend.
states provides tax breaks for some companies?
Well, the DARPA project is a huge, federal government sponsored funded research project. So these things are happening. I think the difference is that the scale. I think probably in China we have engaged a much larger scale than probably in Europe and the United States. And on this issue, at WTO, for example, is actually very blurred. Whether the kind of subsidies towards R&D development, how much is allowed, to what extent is allowed.
What form?
And the boundary is not very well defined, in my opinion. So so from a legal perspective, it's a gray area. And probably in the next round at WTO reform, we can strengthen that position and clarify these issues. Okay?
But obviously, two sides have different understandings about industrial policies. Will they try to keep their differences, or they have to come to an agreement of some sort?
Well, China is a country that has a very strong industrial policy. There's no doubt about this, right? But I think the difference is that I think we should judge the things you mentioned, right? Have a reality check. My advice to you would be, don't make too much use of the targets they set. These are the things written down by these bureaucrats in MIT, I guess, right? And these people, set this grand design, and they make these things, very important. But if you talk to the companies, if you talk to the real Chinese companies, I'm a little bit skeptical as to how many companies really heed to these documents too much, especially private companies. So this is a great target they set, but do they actually go back and check, say, 3 or 4 years later, whether these targets are being met? I have my fair share of skepticism about this.
And another aspect of this question is that whether these reforms or changes are in line with our interests, Chinese interests. For example, Robert Kuhn, advisor to Chinese government, and also one of our commentators said that the U.S. demands were good for America in the short term, but actually better for China in the long term, such as state subsidies to SOEs and IPR protections. That means the state should not be too much heavy-handed in the operations of those enterprises?
Right, well,
let them decide on their own?
Yeah, the industrial policy issue itself is actually quite controversial in the field of economics, and there's different opinions about this. And my personal opinion is that it's probably effective during the early stage of economic development time. It's probably effective in, when people use this infant industry argument. But over the long run, the record so far among many countries, many governments, haven't been very good, actually. So, and I think that industrial policy issue per se really doesn't touch upon the core value, ideological value of China's socialist market economy. So it's an issue can be debated, I think. It's an issue that can even change in the future. I don't mean to imply that industrial policy should be totally kicked out, but I think at least we need to reflect on the effectiveness of this and way to do this and how to improve this. Now I think the real issue here, touching upon the core value of our socialist economic system, is with respect to the state-owned enterprises. I think that's a very important issue here.
But China can only move on that front on its own agenda. That's always been what we've been saying, not under pressure from that.
Well, I mean,
is that something?
Well, having said that, I don't think there's a big conflict here, because we have said that we are willing to adhere to the concept you talk about, the competitive neutrality principle, right? SOE phenomenon is not just unique in China. In Europe, we have also a lot of SOEs. In America, there's no one. U.S. Postal Service is SOE, I guess. So, in Europe, they don't have a problem. There are countries in Europe that have many large SOEs, and they don't have a problem. And I don't know why China should have a problem, as long as we, set the same set of standards under the broader competitive neutrality framework.
Another interesting development is, of course, the Huawei case. The U.S. Justice Department announced indictment against Huawei and the affiliate companies. Do you think the Huawei case can complicate the trade talks, or is just on the opposite, on the other parallel side? Because Robert Lighthizer said that is a legal issue, that is not a trade negotiation issue.
But President Trump said no. I mean, look, read his read his what he said in the journal press. He said, we haven't talked about Huawei so far. We are going to talk about Huawei down the road. I mean, that's what he basically said. I'm not quoting his exact words, but that's what he's implying. So I think what he said.
How does the Huawei issue fit into this economic and trade dialogue, if it is?
Well, you know, there are two cases so far right now. One is the case in Seattle regarding, you know, quote, the theft of intellectual property from T-Mobile, and there's a separate case in New York City regarding Ms. Nguyen, about the Iran embargo. And I think I haven't seen the whole information about the New York City case, but regarding the Seattle case, from reading the complaint from the grand jury, it's clear that some employees of Huawei did make a mistake. They did commit a crime, in my opinion. And of course, they're still innocent to proven good, but I think there's no doubt about this, okay, in my mind. But this is a separate case, okay? But you know, but the issue is that is this case by itself enough to, you know, to make Huawei the scapegoat of, in my opinion, a concerted effort.
That's what I want to ask. Jake, do you think this is just a legal issue concerning certain cases, or there is a, should I say, a conspiracy behind this to contain Huawei as a Chinese telecom giant to enter Western markets for national security reasons, which Chinese doesn't believe?
My answer is yes, but you go ahead.
My perspective would be that this is a criminal justice matter that's independent of the trade matters, as Ambassador Lighthizer said. Will it have an impact on the trade negotiations? Almost certainly. Indicting one of China's most prominent international companies is very likely to impact the perceptions of the Chinese government when it comes to negotiating with the United States, but the U.S. maintains a fair, transparent judicial system. Anyone who's brought to justice there will have their day in court.
But the problem is they say that Huawei can never enter the American market because of national security concerns, and they encourage their allies, for example, Europeans and Australians.
This argument is not based on this case in Seattle. This argument is based on a theory, a hypothesis, a conviction.
Yeah, there's no proof.
There's no proof that there's a backdoor in any of the Huawei equipment. They're saying that the 5G network is
so. Do you think the Chinese will put this on the agenda?
I think, of course, we want to make the case that there's no reason to, in my opinion, politically prosecute this company, to lock out this company out of the Western market. There's no reason for that.
There's no way for any of us to know what the national security implications are for any product, because we don't have the information available to make an assessment.
But it has to be based on facts,
but what
evidence.
I would absolutely agree with Professor Gong that if we're restricting certain types of technology, we need to be transparent and we need to be very narrowly tailored about how we do so. We give that message to the Chinese government, we would give the same one to the U.S.
Okay. Very briefly, how likely China and the U.S. will reach a deal by March the 1st and everybody's happy?
I think 100%.
100%.
Keep fingers crossed. Keep fingers crossed. 100%.
We're optimistic that if enough of the structural issues can be resolved, then perhaps the two sides will be able to move forward. Reducing these tariffs from both the U.S. and China is the top priority, and we need to make sure that that moves forward faithfully.
Now, that is helpful to all sides. Well, thank you very much, Jake, and thank you, John. And this has been Dialogue. We've been talking about the trade dialogues between China and the U.S. I'm Zoe. Goodbye for now.